She boarded quietly, wearing a crisp military uniform and holding a first-class ticket. No fuss, no demands, just a calm soldier returning home. But minutes after taking her seat, a flight attendant stopped, looked her up and down, and said the words that stunned the entire cabin. "You don't belong here." She was forced to move to the back of the plane, humiliated in front of strangers. No one stood up for her. No one questioned it. She didn't argue. She simply took out her phone and sent one short message. That message didn't just change her seat, it changed everything. Before the flight touched the ground, the pilot received a call. The airline scrambled into damage control, and the woman who judged her had no idea who she had just pushed aside. What happens next will make you question how many others were silently dismissed, without anyone ever knowing. Keep watching. This story doesn't end the way you think. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. The plane doors were just beginning to close when Danica stepped inside, her military boots making a soft thud against the cabin floor. Her uniform was crisp, and her posture held the kind of calm that only came from years of discipline. She wasn't here to impress anyone. All she wanted was to reach her seat and rest. This was her first flight home after a long deployment overseas. Her father had surprised her with a first-class ticket as a welcome home gift. He didn't say much when he handed it to her, just a firm nod and a quiet, "You earned it." That was enough. She didn't need praise, just peace. Danica moved through the cabin quietly, scanning the seat numbers until she found 3A, right next to the window. She slid into her seat, folded her uniform jacket carefully, and tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her. A few passengers looked her way, some with polite smiles, others barely noticing her at all. She didn't mind. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the last year ease off her shoulders, but her calm didn't last long. A flight attendant walked down the aisle toward her. Her name tag read Ms. Burke. She was tall, sharp-featured, with a neatly pinned bun and a clipboard in hand. She smiled as she approached, but there was something forced behind it. Her eyes moved from Danica's face to the seat number, then to the uniform. "Excuse me," Ms. Burke said, pausing beside her. "May I see your boarding pass?" Danica opened her eyes, slightly surprised, but nodded and reached into her pocket. She handed over the pass without a word. Ms. Burke glanced at it, then looked back down at her, the corners of her mouth twitching. "This is a first-class seat." "Yes," Danica said calmly. "That's what my ticket says." Ms. Burke's smile thinned. "Are you traveling alone?" Danica nodded once. "I am." The attendant held the ticket a little longer, as if expecting it to change in her hand. Then she handed it back and said, "You're not in the right place. I think there's been a mix-up. This section is reserved for premium customers." Danica looked at her, confused. "This is the seat I was assigned. It's the right one." Ms. Burke didn't back away. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but making it firm. "I'm asking you to move to the back. You may have gotten this ticket by mistake, or maybe someone gave it to you. Either way, I need to clear this up so we can begin takeoff." Danica blinked. "It was a gift. From my father. He purchased it." "I'm sure he meant well," Ms. Burke replied. "But this isn't standard procedure. I need you to come with me." She reached out and placed her hand gently but firmly on Danica's arm, urging her to stand. The contact wasn't rough, but it was enough to make Danica freeze. A few heads nearby turned. Someone whispered. Someone else looked down at their phone, but no one said anything. Danica slowly stood up. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just gathered her things, adjusted her posture, and began the walk to the back of the plane. No one looked her in the eyes. No one offered a word. She found an empty seat in economy and sat down quietly. The seat was tighter, the space more cramped, but she didn't care. What hurt wasn't the downgrade. It was the way it happened, like she didn't belong, like she had done something wrong. Her hands were trembling slightly. She reached into her backpack, pulled out her phone and opened her messages. She typed a short message to her father. She made me move to economy. Said I didn't belong. I didn't argue, but she put her hand on me. I'm okay. Just upset. She hit send. Then she placed the phone face down on her lap and stared straight ahead. And even though the plane seemed calm again, Danica knew in her gut. This wasn't over. Danica sat quietly in the cramped economy seat. Her back straight and her hands resting on her lap. She stared at the seat back in front of her, but her thoughts were racing. She had trained herself to stay composed in tense situations. That's what years in the military taught her. But no training had prepared her for the kind of insult she had just experienced. It wasn't just about being moved. It was about being judged, instantly, unfairly, and publicly. Her phone vibrated. She looked down and saw a reply from her father. Short, sharp, and unlike him. What exactly happened? Start from the beginning. Danica's fingers moved quickly, her jaw clenched as she typed. She saw my uniform. Asked for my ticket. I showed her. She still told me to move, said it was reserved for premium customers. She pushed my arm, not hard but enough to make a point. There was a pause, long enough to make her feel the weight of what she had just written. Then another message came. What's your flight number? She read the words twice. Danica knew that tone. Her father wasn't asking for information casually. He was a man who knew how systems worked. Not just in the military, but far beyond. When he asked for details like that, it meant action was coming. She sent the number, then put the phone away and stared out the window. Somewhere at the front of the plane, Ms. Burke was moving through the first-class cabin again, pouring drinks, smiling at passengers, acting like nothing had happened. The image of her smug face sent another wave of frustration through Danica's chest. Near the galley, another flight attendant, a younger woman named Tina, approached her carefully. Was there really something wrong with her ticket? She asked in a low voice, glancing toward the back of the plane. Ms. Burke didn't even look up. She didn't look like she belonged there, she said, adjusting a tray. That's usually a red flag. Could have been someone using someone else's ticket. I didn't want to take any chances. Tina looked uneasy. But she showed it to you, right? She did. But trust me, I've seen enough passengers trying to cheat the system. First class isn't for anyone. Tina bit her tongue and walked away. She didn't want to start a fight. But something about the whole thing felt wrong. Meanwhile, Danica's phone vibrated again. Don't worry about anything else, just sit tight, I'll handle it. Danica leaned her head against the window, trying to calm herself. But something told her. The flight was about to take a turn no one expected. Up in the cockpit, the captain was focused on his instruments when the in-flight phone buzzed beside him. He reached over and picked it up without much thought. Captain Reynolds. A voice on the other end spoke clearly, firmly. This is Commander Victor Thompson. I'm calling in reference to a passenger on Flight 227. My daughter, Sergeant Danica Thompson, was just removed from her first-class seat by a flight attendant. The captain straightened in his chair. Yes, sir, I wasn't aware of any. She was humiliated in front of other passengers, physically touched, and downgraded without cause. The voice continued. I've already spoken with the Department of Aviation Security. Expect a call shortly. Until then, I suggest you speak with your lead flight attendant and verify what happened. The line clicked off before the captain could respond. For a moment, all he could do was sit there and stare at the controls, the weight of that call settling in fast. He reached for the cabin intercom and pressed the button. Ms. Burke, please report to the cockpit immediately. Back in the first-class cabin, Ms. Burke paused mid-step. She looked confused, even slightly annoyed, but she turned and made her way to the front of the plane. Danica didn't turn around, but she heard the announcement. Her stomach tensed. Whatever was about to happen had already started. Inside the cockpit, Ms. Burke stepped in, still wearing her customer service smile. You called for me, Captain? He didn't smile back. Do you remember a passenger in 3A? A female soldier? Ms. Burke hesitated for a second. Yes, there was a mix-up with her seat assignment. I asked her to move. Did you check her ticket? I glanced at it, yes. Did it match the seat? Ms. Burke shifted slightly. It did, but she wasn't listed on my roster. I assumed it was an error. The captain nodded slowly. You assumed, without verification. She was dressed in uniform, Ms. Burke added, her tone defensive now. Passengers sometimes use that for sympathy upgrades. I was just making sure. The captain's jaw tightened. That passenger, he said, is Sergeant Danica Thompson, daughter of Commander Victor Thompson. He's currently overseeing defense operations at the national level, and he's already spoken with the Department of Aviation Security. You've just escalated this flight into a federal matter. Ms. Burke's face paled. I need you to return to her immediately, the captain continued. You will apologize, in front of the cabin, and you will escort her back to her seat. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. And, Ms. Burke, the captain added, this flight may not reach its destination as planned. You've triggered a federal review mid-air. If that soldier's rights were violated, we'll be landing sooner than expected. Ms. Burke turned and left the cockpit slowly, her hands trembling. For the first time in her long career, she didn't feel in charge. She felt exposed, and she had no idea what was waiting for her outside that cockpit door. Ms. Burke stepped out of the cockpit with her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The air in the cabin suddenly felt heavy. Passengers continued watching movies, flipping through magazines, sipping champagne, but she felt every step like a spotlight was on her. Her polished smile was gone. Her steps weren't as firm. For the first time, the aisle felt long. She hesitated just before reaching the economy section, her eyes searching for Danica. When she finally saw her, sitting calmly, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the window, she froze for a second. The woman she had pushed aside an hour ago was now the reason her name was likely being discussed at Federal Aviation Headquarters. The other flight attendants watched silently from their positions. Tina, standing near the galley, exchanged a quiet look with another crew member. No one spoke. No one offered help. Ms. Burke smoothed her uniform, forced a breath through her nose, and approached Danica's row. Sergeant Thompson, she began, crouching slightly to be at eye level. Her voice was lower now, carefully measured. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class. Danica turned her head slowly. Her face was unreadable. A misunderstanding? Yes, Ms. Burke replied quickly. Your name wasn't showing properly on our cabin manifest. I assumed there had been an error, but it's been resolved now. Danica looked at her for a moment, then down at her phone. She typed a message with calm fingers. She's here, wants me to go back. Says it was a misunderstanding. The reply from her father came within seconds. Make her say exactly what she did. Not excuses, not protocol. The truth. Danica looked up at Ms. Burke again. You told me to move. You said I didn't belong in first class, and you touched me. Ms. Burke stiffened. It was a small gesture. You touched me, Danica repeated calmly. And now you want to act like it never happened. Nearby passengers were listening now. Some had paused their screens. Others had lowered their drinks. The atmosphere shifted, tense, awkward, still. Ms. Burke's throat was dry. I misjudged the situation. I may have overstepped, and I apologize for the inconvenience. Danica raised an eyebrow. You didn't ask anyone else in first class to show their ticket. Only me. Why? The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Ms. Burke hesitated, glancing around at the watching passengers. Her face turned a shade paler. I made a mistake, she admitted quietly. I assumed, and I was wrong. Danica stood slowly. Her voice was quiet, but every word was clear. Then say it loud enough for them to hear. Ms. Burke swallowed hard. Then, standing up straight, She turned slightly toward the nearby passengers. "I wrongly removed Sergeant Thompson from her seat. She had a valid ticket. I judged her unfairly, and I apologize." The silence that followed was louder than any words. Danica didn't say thank you. She picked up her backpack, gave a small nod, and began walking back toward first class. She didn't need an apology. The damage was already done. Danica walked back to the front of the plane with quiet strength. Her steps were steady, her expression calm, but she could feel the shift in the cabin. First-class passengers who had once ignored her now looked up as she passed. Some looked guilty, others quickly looked away. No one said a word. She reached her original seat, 3A, and sat down again, placing her backpack under the seat just as she had the first time. She didn't glance at Ms. Burke, who followed a few paces behind her. The flight attendant stood awkwardly beside her for a moment, unsure of what else to say. "If there's anything I can offer you," she said finally, "please let me know." Danica didn't respond. She opened the small book in her lap and turned to a random page. Her silence was louder than any reply. Ms. Burke turned stiffly and walked back down the aisle. Her face was hot, her hands clammy. She didn't dare make eye contact with the other passengers. In the galley, Tina was waiting. She raised her eyebrows as Ms. Burke approached. "Well?" Tina asked softly. "I apologized," Ms. Burke muttered. "You looked like you were walking to a courtroom," Tina said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Ms. Burke glared at her. "Not the time." "I'm just saying," Tina replied. "It didn't look like it went well." Ms. Burke ignored her and grabbed a tray to keep herself busy. But her hands were shaking slightly. It was starting to hit her now. Not just what she had done, but who she had done it to, and who her father was. She had handled many tough passengers in her years, but none of them had ever made her feel this exposed. Back in first class, Danica flipped the pages of her book, but her eyes weren't reading. She was watching, not the words, just the silence, the tension, the awkward glances around her. The man across the aisle, an older gentleman in a tailored navy suit, leaned over slightly. I saw what happened earlier," he said quietly. "That was unfortunate." Danica looked up, her expression unreadable. "Unfortunate?" He cleared his throat. "Yes, well, clearly it was a mistake. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." Danica tilted her head. "Did you say anything when it happened?" He hesitated. "No. I didn't think it was my place." "Exactly," she said, and looked back at her book. The man leaned back in his seat, suddenly interested in the untouched drink on his tray. Danica's phone buzzed. "Dad." "Good. I've been briefed. Stay seated. Security is waiting at the gate." Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. She simply took a deep breath and turned another page. The plane hummed quietly as it cruised through the sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted completely. It was no longer just a routine flight. It was a quiet storm, and everyone could feel it. First-class passengers who once chatted freely were now still, their gazes flickering between Danica and the flight attendants. Even the ones who hadn't seen the incident unfold had felt the tension ripple through the cabin. Something had happened, something that changed the air. Danica sat with her book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. Her thoughts ran far from the printed pages. She thought about the look on Ms. Burke's face as she stood there, forced to apologize. She thought about how no one had defended her when she was told to move. And she thought about her father, the way he didn't raise his voice, didn't panic. He simply took action. Quiet, focused, unstoppable. The curtain between first class and economy fluttered as Ms. Burke stepped through again, tray in hand. She walked slowly, her steps no longer confident. There was no trace of the tight smile she had worn earlier. Instead, her mouth was pressed in a thin, pale line. Her eyes scanned the passengers quickly, avoiding Danica's seat altogether. She approached a woman in 2C and asked if she wanted a drink. The passenger nodded stiffly, her eyes flicking toward Danica for a second before returning to her tray. It was a subtle move, but Danica caught it. Everyone had seen enough to understand what had happened, even if they pretended not to. Miss Burke moved through the aisle, taking orders with a kind of forced politeness that made her voice shake. She stopped near Tina, who was arranging items in the galley, and leaned in slightly. "I offered her a drink," Ms. Burke whispered. Tina didn't look up. Did she take it? She just said nothing. "She doesn't have to say anything," Tina replied calmly. "She's already said enough without speaking." Ms. Burke's jaw clenched. "Do you think they're really going to do something?" I apologized. I explained it was a mistake. Tina finally looked up, her voice steady. "You didn't check her ticket, you put your hand on her, and you judged her before she even said a word. I didn't mean anything by it." "But you did it," Tina replied. "That's what matters." Ms. Burke turned away, unable to respond. She poured another drink, her fingers trembling as she set the glass onto a tray. She couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on her from every angle, even when they weren't. Every quiet conversation, every sideways glance felt like judgment, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was the one being watched. Back in her seat, Danica's phone buzzed again. "Dad, you'll see someone enter the cabin when you land. Stay seated. Let them come to you." Danica responded with just one word. "Okay." She closed the book on her lap and set it on the tray table. Her eyes shifted to the window, watching clouds float by. She had been through worse situations in her life. She had seen combat zones, survived storms, led her team through chaos. But something about this quiet flight, this small moment of humiliation, stung deeper than she expected. It wasn't the seat. It wasn't even the push. It was the silence that followed. The way everyone looked away. That silence said more than any words could. But now, that silence was cracking. And Danica could feel something building, something big. And this time she wasn't going to be the one moved. As the flight began its slow descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial approach. Please return to your seats and ensure all tray tables are in the upright position." The usual shuffle began, passengers buckling seatbelts, folding blankets, finishing drinks. But beneath that routine, something else stirred, a quiet anticipation. It moved through the cabin like a wave, unspoken but present. Many didn't know the full story, but they knew enough to sense that the end of this flight wouldn't be ordinary. Danica sat still, her seatbelt already fastened. She could feel the tension in her neck and shoulders, but she didn't shift. She simply waited, her phone resting quietly in her palm, her eyes straight ahead. There was a calmness in her that came from knowing what was coming, not just from her father's messages, but from the simple fact that people like Ms. Burke didn't get away with things when they picked the wrong target. Behind her, Tina moved quietly through the aisle, collecting cups and checking overhead bins. She reached Danica's row and paused. She looked at her for a moment, not out of pity, but respect. "If there's anything I can get you before landing," she said softly, "please let me know." Danica gave her a short nod. "Thank you." Tina offered the slightest smile and moved on. A few rows behind, Ms. Burke stood stiffly in the galley, watching every move Tina made. She had stopped offering drinks long ago. She didn't want to walk through the aisle anymore. Not when she knew eyes would follow her. Not when she knew who was sitting in 3A. The weight of her mistake was no longer a private burden. It was public. Every moment since that push had become a spotlight, and now it was closing in. Her uniform felt tighter than usual. The collar rubbed against her neck. Her mouth was dry, and even the smallest task, like folding napkins, felt like a challenge. Tina returned to the galley and quietly began putting things away. "They're going to meet her at the gate," she said without looking up. Ms. Burke stiffened. "What do you mean?" "There's security waiting," Tina replied. "The captain just confirmed it. She's not just anyone, you know. Her father has connections everywhere. She's just a soldier. No, Tina said sharply. She's a soldier who was shoved out of her seat by someone who didn't even bother to look at her ticket. Ms. Burke turned away, pressing her hands to the counter. She had told herself it was a small error, a simple seat correction. But that lie no longer held, because she hadn't checked anything. She hadn't paused to ask. She had looked at the uniform, the skin, the calm posture, and decided she didn't belong. And now she was about to face the price of that judgment. The plane tilted slightly as it made its final approach. From the window, the runway came into view, stretching long and smooth beneath the afternoon sky. Danica watched it without blinking. She didn't know what the next hour would look like, but she didn't feel nervous. She felt ready. She reached down, tightened her seatbelt, and took one last deep breath. And in that quiet moment, with the city below and the plane beginning to lower, one thing became certain. For Ms. Burke, the landing would be far rougher than takeoff. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thud, followed by the familiar roar of reverse thrusters slowing the plane to a crawl. A few passengers clapped lightly, as some often did, but even that felt forced, half-hearted, uncertain. No one really knew what to expect anymore. The usual relief that came with landing wasn't there. Instead, a strange silence settled over the cabin. The kind that came when people knew they had witnessed something wrong, and now they were waiting to see how it would be answered. Danica remained still, hands folded on her lap. Her phone buzzed once. "Dad. They're at the gate. Wait for them." She didn't reply. She simply slid the phone into her jacket pocket and stared ahead. Her jaw was relaxed, her breathing steady, but her eyes were sharp, focused, clear. She wasn't angry anymore. That had passed. What she felt now was something deeper, steadier, the kind of clarity that came from knowing the truth had caught up to someone who thought they'd never be held accountable. The plane rolled slowly toward the gate, and as it did, heads began to turn. Not toward the windows, but toward the front of the plane, toward Danica, toward the curtain. Ms. Burke stood frozen in the galley, her back straight, but her face pale. Every part of her body was tense. She knew what was coming. She had heard the message relayed from the captain through Tina. She had seen the glances from passengers, and she felt the weight of judgment in every step she took since her apology. Tina glanced at her from across the galley. "You should get ready." "For what?" Ms. Burke asked, though she already knew the answer. Tina didn't reply. She just turned away and resumed organizing the serving trays. Her silence was louder than words. The seatbelt sign dinged off. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we have come to a complete stop at the gate. Thank you for flying with us." Danica stayed exactly where she was. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply waited. Then, the cabin door opened with a sharp hiss. Voices outside. Footsteps. Then silence. A moment later, a man in a dark uniform stepped into the plane. Tall, broad-shouldered, calm. His badge was clipped to his chest. His face was unreadable. He didn't look at the passengers. He didn't look at the other attendants. He looked straight at Ms. Burke. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you'll need to come with us." Ms. Burke's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The man stepped forward. "There has been a formal complaint and federal notification of misconduct during the flight. You'll be escorted for questioning immediately." A quiet gasp moved through the first few rows. One passenger's hand shot up with their phone, pretending to check a message, but clearly recording. Ms. Burke tried to gather herself. I didn't mean—" "You'll have the opportunity to explain," the officer said calmly. "But not here." She looked around as if someone might step in. Say something. Offer help. No one did. She straightened her uniform, lifted her chin, and stepped out into the aisle. Each step toward the front of the cabin felt heavier than the last. Passengers watched silently, a few leaning to the side just slightly to get a better look. As she passed Danica's seat, she made the mistake of glancing down. Danica met her eyes, calm, composed, unshaken, and somehow that quiet gaze felt more powerful than any words Ms. Burke could have ever heard. She looked away instantly and kept walking. As she disappeared through the cabin door, the silence in the plane deepened. It wasn't until the door sealed shut behind her that people finally exhaled. In her seat, Danica leaned back slowly. She had said nothing, but everything had been heard, and the real consequences were only just beginning. As the cabin door shut behind Miss Burke, a quiet ripple of movement swept through the plane. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, standing slowly, retrieving bags from overhead bins. But their movements were stiff, almost mechanical. It wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the aftermath of something everyone knew had gone terribly wrong. Danica remained seated. She didn't need to rush. She wasn't in a hurry to get off the plane. In fact, she had been told not to. Her father's instructions were clear. Stay seated, stay composed, let the next step come to you. So she waited, patiently, unmoved by the noise around her. The man in 3C, who had been pretending to read during the entire second half of the flight, finally spoke. "I didn't know," he muttered, almost to himself, "that you were someone important." Danica turned her head slightly. Her expression didn't change. "I'm not. I just had a valid seat." He looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't mean it like that." "But that's how it works, doesn't it?" she replied. "You're only someone when people find out who your family is. Not when you're mistreated. Not when you're humiliated. Only when it becomes inconvenient for someone else." The man had no reply. He reached for his suitcase and stood up quietly. Around her, more passengers were beginning to move, though they did so differently than before. The casual smiles and business-like small talk were gone. There was an uncomfortable awareness in the air now, a realization that they had witnessed something wrong and stayed silent. Tina appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, scanning the rows. Her eyes met Danica's, and she walked over carefully. "They've cleared the exit. You're welcome to deplane now if you'd like." Danica nodded. "Are they still outside?" Tina nodded back. "Yes. 2 airport security officers and a representative from the airline. They're not here to question you, just to walk you through and provide any assistance." Danica stood, lifting her backpack from under the seat. "I won't need assistance, just the way out." Tina hesitated, then lowered her voice. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I should have said something earlier. I saw how she treated you and I froze. I shouldn't have." Danica looked at her, not unkindly. "Now you know how it feels." Tina nodded slowly, her face pink with shame. Danica turned toward the aisle, her shoulders square, her steps steady. She didn't rush, didn't glance back. As she passed the remaining first-class passengers, they shifted in their seats, unsure of what to do, whether to apologize, speak, or simply stay silent. Most chose silence. Some bowed their heads slightly. One woman reached into her purse and pulled out a phone, not to record, but to text, probably to relay the scene to someone who hadn't been on the flight. Danica stepped into the jet bridge. The air felt different, cooler, sharper. Waiting just ahead were 2 uniformed security officers and a man in a navy blue suit wearing a silver airline pin on his lapel. His posture was straight, his expression neutral, but respectful. "Sergeant Thompson," he said, extending a hand. "My name is Kenneth Moore. I'm with the airline's executive response team. We've been informed of the situation. Your father has requested full transparency and accountability from our side. I'd like to escort you to the executive lounge where he's waiting." Danica didn't take his hand, but she nodded. "Lead the way." As they began walking through the terminal, employees along the way took notice. Some stood straighter, some stepped aside quickly as if knowing something serious had just occurred. No one asked questions. No one needed to. The presence of uniformed security and a senior executive walking beside a calm soldier told them enough. They passed through a set of frosted glass doors that opened into a private corridor. The noise of the terminal faded behind them. Everything grew quieter, more polished. The floors were spotless, the lighting soft, the air slightly chilled. At the end of the corridor was a set of double doors marked Executive Lounge, private access only. Kenneth paused before pushing them open. Your father is inside. If you need anything, legal support, a written statement, anything at all, we're prepared to assist. Danica looked at him. Does she still work for your airline? He didn't answer right away. Not at the moment. She's been placed on immediate suspension pending full investigation. Danica nodded. That's a start. Kenneth pushed open the door, stepping aside to let her through. And as she entered the lounge, the quiet sound of a coffee machine in the distance and the low hum of private conversations faded behind her. Because now, the real conversation was just beginning. Inside the executive lounge, the air was still, almost too quiet. Soft lights glowed from the walls, and the scent of roasted coffee lingered faintly in the background. Plush leather chairs and private seating areas were scattered throughout, but only one person was seated, alone in the far corner, his back straight, one leg crossed neatly over the other, his hands resting on a closed folder. Danica's eyes landed on him immediately. Her father. Victor Thompson wasn't a loud man, he never had been, but there was a quiet gravity around him that made people stand straighter when he entered a room. He had the kind of presence that didn't need to be explained. Years of service, countless missions, decisions made under pressure. It all showed in the way he sat, the way he breathed, the way he listened. He stood when he saw her, nodded once, and opened his arms for a brief, firm hug. You all right? He asked, not letting her go until she gave a slow nod. I'm okay, Danica said, her voice calm. Better now. He pulled back and searched her face for a moment just to be sure. Then he gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit. Let's talk. Danica dropped her backpack beside the seat and sat down, her posture just as straight as his. The quiet between them wasn't tense. It was focused. They didn't need to rush through emotions. They had been trained to handle chaos with clear minds. I read the report, Victor said, tapping the folder with 2 fingers. I also watched the footage from the cabin. Some passengers recorded it. The story's already moving through aviation channels. It'll reach the media within 24 hours. Danica stayed silent. Victor continued. The airline's already issued an internal statement. They're pushing the misunderstanding angle, hoping to handle this quietly. Danica's expression didn't change. Of course they are. But we're not letting it go, he said. This wasn't just about a bad attitude or poor customer service. This was about judgment, disrespect, discrimination. They want to settle it with a public apology, maybe a free voucher and a press release saying they're reviewing procedures. He opened the folder and pushed it toward her. Inside were printed emails, incident summaries, and a copy of her original boarding pass, Seat 3A, clearly marked. Her name, her title, her ID, everything in black and white. She didn't check anything, Danica said quietly. She didn't care to, Victor replied. There was a pause. She's suspended, he said. Pending investigation, but that's not enough. Danica tilted her head. You want her fired? Victor gave a small shake of his head. This isn't about revenge. It's about consequence, real consequence. Firing her quietly does nothing. She'll move on, maybe start again at another airline, maybe do the same thing to someone who doesn't have a father, with access to every senior contact in the Department of Transportation. He leaned forward. I want public policy change. Mandatory anti-bias training for every cabin crew. I want a review system that allows passengers to safely report discrimination without being dismissed as difficult. And I want that airline to issue a public apology not just to you, but to every uniformed service member who's been disrespected in silence. Danica watched him. This wasn't new to her. Her father didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply set goals and reached them every time. They'll fight it, she said. They'll lose. he replied. Another pause. Danica picked up the boarding pass from the folder and stared at it. All this because she looked at me and decided I didn't belong, she said. Victor nodded slowly. And now she'll spend the rest of her career asking herself why she did. Danica set the pass down. She sent me an apology. Victor raised an eyebrow. Did you answer? I told her I wasn't angry, Danica said. But I also told her this isn't just about me. I said I didn't care if she was sorry. I care if she changes. Victor's eyes held hers for a moment, then he gave a slight nod of approval. That's the difference between you and her, he said. You were judged, but you never stopped carrying yourself with dignity, even when no one stood with you. Danica sat back in the chair, her mind drifting for a moment. I didn't ask for all this, she said. No, he replied, but it asked for you. A soft knock sounded at the door. Kenneth Moore, the airline executive who had escorted her earlier, stepped in again. We've cleared the terminal. Press isn't here yet, but they've started calling. Would you both like to use a private exit? Victor looked at Danica. She considered it for a second, then shook her head. No, she said. Let them see me. Kenneth gave a respectful nod. Understood. Victor stood, picked up the folder and closed it. He glanced at his daughter, his soldier, and gave a rare, quiet smile. Let's go remind them who you are. Danica stood beside her father as the lounge doors opened, the quiet professionalism of the private space giving way to the fluorescent glow of the terminal corridor. It was a long walk to the exit, but she didn't feel small walking it. Not anymore. With every step she carried more than her backpack. She carried what had happened, and the weight of it no longer pressed her down. It grounded her. 2 airline security officers flanked them discreetly, more for protocol than protection. Ahead of them, Kenneth Moore walked briskly, phone in hand, answering messages and giving clipped, quiet responses. Though the airline had tried to keep things quiet, they were already losing control of the story. Social media posts from passengers were circulating, blurry videos of Ms. Burke escorting Danica back to first class, and whispers about a soldier being kicked out of her seat had started spreading online like smoke from a fire. Passengers still in the terminal began to take notice. A few slowed their steps. Some stared. One woman in a gray pantsuit nudged her husband and whispered something. Eyes locked on Danica. A child looked up and asked, "Is she famous?" His mother shushed him gently, eyes wide with recognition, not of Danica's name, but of the story she had just become part of. Danica didn't flinch. She kept her chin high, her posture steady. The uniform she wore wasn't just cloth and stitching, it was earned. And now, it was a reminder, not of war, but of what respect was supposed to mean. As they reached the outer doors of the terminal, a young employee stepped forward nervously, holding a tablet. She looked flustered, like she had been sent to deliver a message she didn't understand. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, addressing Victor. "Yes. The CEO is requesting a call as soon as possible. He's asking if you'll consider a sit-down meeting before speaking to the press. He wants to handle this internally." Victor looked at Danica. Danica didn't hesitate. "Tell him I'm not interested in silence." The employee swallowed hard and nodded. I'll pass that along." They stepped outside into the cool, late afternoon air. The sky was a pale gray, and a soft breeze drifted through the open space of the private pickup zone. Waiting at the curb was a black SUV, its engine quietly running. Victor opened the door for his daughter. She slid in, resting her hands on her knees, staring out the window as her father joined her on the other side. The driver closed the door behind them and pulled away without a word. For a while, neither of them spoke. The city moved past them slowly. Busy intersections, blinking traffic lights, pedestrians walking with purpose. Life unchanged. But for Danica, something had shifted. And not just for her. After several blocks, Victor finally broke the silence. "You know what's going to happen next, don't you?" Danica nodded slightly. "They'll try to fix it with a statement, maybe suspend her officially. Say it was poor training, miscommunication. Victor nodded. And? They'll wait for it to fade. Most things do. But this one won't. Danica turned her head toward him. Not if we don't let it. He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his seat. We're drafting a policy proposal tonight. I'm forwarding it to the Department of Aviation. You're going to help me write it. Danica raised an eyebrow. Language matters, he said. You've earned the right to decide how that policy should feel, not just what it says. She nodded slowly, a quiet sense of purpose growing inside her. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about every quiet injustice that went unchallenged. Every time someone was moved, dismissed, or disrespected for not looking like they belonged. They weren't just going to end the story. They were going to start a new one. Back at the airport, behind closed doors, Ms. Burke sat alone in a sterile conference room, waiting to be called in. Her hands were clenched on the table, her blazer still perfectly buttoned, though it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a costume she couldn't take off. She had already read the preliminary notice from HR. She knew what was coming. Investigation, review, possible termination. But what weighed heavier than that was the fact that she had done this to herself. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had made a choice. And that choice had led her here, to this cold room, this silence, this reckoning. Her name wasn't trending yet, but Danica's was. And with every refresh of the news feed on her phone, Ms. Burke could see the moment slipping further from her control. Her career wasn't just in danger, it was already behind her. And in a city miles away, the woman she had underestimated was now working on a new set of rules. Ones that would make sure no one else ever felt that same quiet humiliation again. Because the next time someone tried to move a soldier out of her seat, they'd think twice. Night had fallen over the city by the time Danica reached her father's apartment. The skyline blinked in the distance, scattered lights flickering across high-rise windows, traffic humming below like the steady pulse of a giant machine. But inside the apartment, everything was still, organized, quiet, and filled with a strange mix of comfort and intensity. The kind of place where calm lived right next to command. Danica changed out of her uniform and into a simple sweatshirt and jeans, then joined her father in the small study where the lights were dim, and the table was cleared except for a laptop, a legal pad, and a half-empty mug of black coffee. Victor was already typing when she entered, the sharp click of the keys cutting through the silence. "They've issued a statement," he said without turning. Danica crossed her arms. "Let me guess. We regret the incident. We do not tolerate discrimination. We're investigating further." He turned the screen toward her. "We are aware of an incident involving one of our crew members and a passenger who is a decorated U.S. service member. We take this matter seriously and have placed the crew member on temporary leave while we conduct a full internal investigation. We remain committed to treating all passengers with dignity and respect." Danica let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "So they still won't say my name or hers. They're protecting themselves," Victor said flatly. "They think vague words will buy time, buy silence." She stepped closer. "And you're not going to let that happen." He nodded, then gestured to the legal pad beside him. "I've written the framework. You fill in the rest." Danica picked up the pen slowly. "What do you want me to write?" "Not what I want," Victor replied. "What needs to be said?" She stared at the page, the blank lines like runways, waiting for direction, for purpose. And then she began to write, "Mandatory policy enforcement against discriminatory passenger handling. No airline employee shall remove, relocate, question, or physically direct any passenger with a valid ticket based solely on appearance, attire, or assumption of status. All removals must be preceded by digital verification of passenger identity and ticket status, recorded on internal flight logs and confirmed by a second crew member. Any violation of this process, intentional or otherwise, shall result in immediate review by an independent ethics board. Additional protections must be established for military personnel, persons with visible disabilities, and individuals traveling alone in premium class seating. Victor watched her as she wrote, his expression calm but proud. Not just because she was strong, but because she was thoughtful. She didn't write out of anger. She wrote with clarity, with purpose, with vision. Danica stopped for a moment and looked at him. "You think they'll listen?" He leaned forward. "They'll listen because the country's watching. And this time, the story isn't being controlled by the airline. It's being told by the person it happened to." She nodded and continued writing, page after page, until her words filled the table. Behind her, the soft sound of a news report buzzed from the living room television. The passenger has since been identified as Sergeant Danica Thompson, daughter of former Commander Victor Thompson, who now serves as Senior Advisor on Aviation Affairs for the Department of Defense. Video footage captured by fellow travelers shows the moment the flight attendant asked the uniformed soldier to move to the economy section without verifying her identity. An increasing number of veterans and active service members are expressing outrage online. Victor muted the television. Danica didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew what was happening. She was no longer just a name on a boarding pass. She had become something else, a symbol of what too many had been forced to endure quietly. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from her father or the airline or the media. It was from a woman named Kelsey, a friend from her unit, still overseas. "Saw the news. You held your ground like always. We're all proud of you." Another buzz. "Also, it's about time someone pushed back." Danica stared at the message and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not pride exactly. Not relief either. Just a sense of rightness. Of being where she needed to be. Not just in her seat, but in the fight that followed. She set the phone down and looked up at her father. "I want to speak," she said. "To the press." Victor studied her face for a second. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. Not to shame her, but to remind people that silence protects no one, and I won't be silent. Victor leaned back in his chair, slowly nodding. "Then we make sure they hear you." And in the quiet of that room, far from the noise of the runway, the press statements, the public apologies, a new voice began to rise, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The next morning arrived not with silence, but with a surge. By 6 a.m., Danica's name was trending across multiple social platforms. Videos from inside the plane had already reached over 3 million views. Screenshots of the apology Ms. Burke had emailed were being dissected line by line in comment threads. And everywhere, from morning talk shows to veteran forums to news podcasts, people were asking the same question: how does something like this still happen? Inside Victor Thompson's apartment, the TV was already on. Danica sat cross-legged on the couch in her sweatshirt, holding a mug of lukewarm tea she hadn't touched. The news anchor's voice drifted over the soft hum of the apartment's heating system. Sergeant Danica Thompson, who was removed from her first-class seat by a flight attendant despite holding a valid ticket, is scheduled to speak publicly for the first time this afternoon. The airline, still under fire, has issued a second, slightly more direct statement, acknowledging failures in cabin protocol and promising a full review. Meanwhile, calls for more transparent passenger rights are spreading nationwide. Danica muted the TV. She didn't need the play-by-play. She was in the middle of it. Victor entered the room, already dressed in a clean button-down, holding his phone, scrolling with focus. "We've had interview requests from 7 major outlets, 2 national magazines, a documentary crew, and a congresswoman wants to meet you personally." Danica raised an eyebrow. "What does she want?" Victor sat down across from her. "She wants to hear your perspective before drafting a passenger protection bill. It might get fast-tracked, especially with how loud this story's gotten." Danica sighed. One flight, one push, and now this. Victor looked her dead in the eyes. Number not just one flight. Every moment like this that happened before and was ignored. You're just the one who refused to be quiet. She set the mug down. "I didn't refuse, I just..." Didn't let them bury it. He nodded. Same thing. There was a knock at the door, a sharp double tap. Danica stood and walked over. When she opened it, a tall woman in a gray blazer stood holding a manila envelope. Ms. Thompson, Danica nodded. I'm here on behalf of the airline. They've prepared a letter, an official written apology signed by the CEO. You are not obligated to accept it or respond. I was only asked to deliver it directly to you. Danica took the envelope without a word. The woman gave a quick nod and turned to leave. Danica closed the door, walked back to the couch, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet, neatly typed. To Sergeant Danica Thompson, we extend our deepest apologies for the events that occurred during Flight 227. The treatment you received does not reflect the values or standards of our airline. We acknowledge the failure to properly verify your boarding status and the inappropriate behavior of our crew member. We are taking immediate steps to ensure this does not happen to another passenger again. You deserved better. We are truly sorry. Sincerely, Harold Beck, CEO. Danica stared at the letter. It was fine, polished, professional, almost human, but also too late. She placed it on the coffee table and sat back down. Victor studied her. You don't look satisfied. I'm not angry, she said. But they didn't say why it happened. They didn't name it, that's the problem. Until they admit what the real issue was, it's just damage control. Victor nodded slowly. You want to name it? She looked at him. Yes, and I want to do it today. He leaned forward. Then let's prepare for your statement. They spent the next 3 hours refining every word. Not a single sentence was wasted. No cliches, no safe phrases. Danica didn't want to come off as bitter or vengeful. She wanted to sound real, controlled, strong. The soldier who didn't yell but made everyone listen. By noon, they arrived at the press conference hall arranged by a local veterans organization. It wasn't a massive event. Just a few cameras, a podium, and rows of folding chairs filled with journalists, bloggers, and a handful of active duty officers who had come simply to support. Danica stood backstage as Victor adjusted the mic. She wore a plain dark blazer and jeans. No uniform, no medals, she didn't need them. A man with a clipboard gave her a final signal. Whenever you're ready. She stepped out. The room quieted instantly. The cameras adjusted. The lights seemed to pause in the air. Danica approached the podium, took a breath, and began. I didn't come here to shame anyone. I didn't come here to destroy a person's career or ruin a company's name. I came here because I was treated like I didn't belong. And I knew I wasn't the first. I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't ask for attention. I had a valid ticket, and I wore a uniform I earned. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. I was asked to move because of how I looked. Because of what someone assumed. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a judgment, a dangerous one. And it happens too often, not just to soldiers, but to people who travel while black, while brown, while disabled, while poor, while quiet, while proud. So I'm using my voice now, not just for me, but for the others who couldn't use theirs. I'm not asking for an apology. I've already received one. I'm asking for accountability, for policy, for a promise that the next time a flight attendant sees someone who doesn't fit their idea of first class, they'll check their bias before they check the boarding pass. Because I belong, we all do, and no seat number can change that. When she finished, the room was silent. Not because they didn't know how to react, but because they knew they had just heard something honest, something necessary. Victor stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, not to guide her off the stage, just to let her know he was there. As the applause finally began to build, first small, then louder, Danica didn't smile. She stood tall, steady, unshaken, and for the first time since Flight 227, she finally felt heard. The days that followed moved fast, faster than Danica had expected. The clip of her speech went viral within hours, reaching millions by evening. It was reposted by military veterans, civil rights organizations, airline workers, news outlets, even celebrities. But it wasn't fame that followed. It was conversation. Her inbox flooded with messages, hundreds from strangers she'd never met. Some were from service members who had faced similar treatment. Others came from parents, students, teachers, passengers, people who had never worn a uniform but had still been made to feel small at 30,000 feet. One message stood out. It was from a retired nurse named Gloria Benton. "I once sat in first class with a ticket bought by my son. The flight attendant asked to see my ID. I was the only one asked. I'm 74 years old. I didn't know how to speak up, but watching you, I felt like you did it for me. Thank you." Danica stared at the screen for a long time before she answered. "You never needed to prove you belonged. That seat was yours. I'm just sorry no one told you that sooner." Behind the scenes, momentum was building fast. Victor had coordinated a formal policy proposal to the Department of Transportation, and with pressure from advocacy groups and national press coverage, it was getting real consideration. The proposal wasn't flashy. It didn't promise overnight change, but it was specific, actionable, and more importantly, it was co-authored by Danica herself. The proposal included mandatory bias awareness training for all airline staff, with real-world scenario testing, third-party oversight committees to review passenger complaints involving removal or seat reassignment, instant verification protocols for ticket disputes, ensuring digital logs of every interaction were stored, protected class flagging, making sure passengers from vulnerable or historically marginalized groups were not singled out for additional scrutiny without cause. It was clear, firm, and unshakable. And for the first time, Danica felt her voice wasn't just being heard, it was changing things. But not everyone was ready to move on. One evening, as she walked into a quiet bookstore cafe for a veterans podcast interview, Danica saw a familiar face sitting alone at a far table, tucked into a corner where most wouldn't notice her. Ms. Burke. Her hair was looser, her posture smaller, but it was unmistakably her. The former flight attendant who had started it all. She wasn't in uniform. She looked tired, not just physically, but worn down from the inside. And as soon as she looked up and saw Danica, her face tightened. Danica didn't approach her. She didn't need to. Their story had played out. But before she left the cafe that night, the manager handed Danica a folded note with shaky handwriting on the front. For Danica. She unfolded it slowly. "I lost my job. I deserve to. I wanted you to know I've started volunteering at a community center near my apartment, working with kids who've never flown before. One of them said she wants to be a pilot because of you. I will never forget what I did to you, but I promise it won't define who I am forever. I'm sorry. Still. Always." MB star Danica folded the note once more. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply placed it in her bag. There would be no friendship, no need for closure talks or face-to-face apologies. But that small piece of paper meant one thing. Change had begun on both sides. In the weeks that followed, airlines across the country issued revisions to their training protocols. Several even reached out to Danica for consultations. She didn't accept most offers. She wasn't interested in becoming a figurehead or a brand. She wanted the story to do what it needed to do, and then let it go. One morning, she received a call from her old unit. They were sending her a framed citation, not for battlefield performance, but for civic bravery. She laughed when she heard that term. "You stood up on a plane, Dan," her commanding officer said. "But the impact hit like a bomb." She accepted the honor, quietly, with grace. And she kept flying. Not because she wasn't afraid of being judged again, but because she refused to let one bad flight ground her forever. On her next trip, she wore jeans and a t-shirt. No uniform. No spotlight. Just a woman with a backpack and a boarding pass. When she approached the gate, the agent smiled and nodded. "Welcome, Ms. Thompson. Seat 2A. Enjoy the flight." No second glances. No questions. No assumptions. And when she sat down in her seat, this time without interruption, she simply looked out the window, took a deep breath, and smiled softly to herself. Not because she had one, but because she knew. She would never have to explain why she belonged again. Spring rolled in slowly, with blooming dogwoods and cleaner skies, and months had passed since the incident on Flight 227, but its impact had only grown stronger with time. By now, the story of Sergeant Danica Thompson had moved far beyond a viral headline. It had become a reference point, spoken about in policy meetings, cited in diversity training seminars, discussed in classrooms across the country. College students wrote essays on the power of silent protest. Airline crews used her story in case study modules about ethics and accountability. And most importantly, ordinary passengers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, began to feel that they could speak up without fear of being ignored. Danica hadn't asked for any of it, but she carried it well. Her days returned to a quieter rhythm. No flashing cameras, no microphones, no urgent calls. She had gone back to her routine, working part-time as a civilian contractor on military readiness systems, tutoring at a nearby youth center on weekends, and spending long hours hiking alone through state parks with only her thoughts and the sound of leaves beneath her boots. Yet the echoes of her story never truly faded. They came in gentle reminders. A woman at the grocery store who touched her elbow and whispered, "You gave me courage to speak up at work." A teenage boy at the bus stop who recognized her and asked, "Were you the one from that flight?" An older man in line at the DMV who, without asking for a picture, simply nodded and said, "Thank you for holding the line." It wasn't fame. It was something deeper. Respect, rooted in truth. One afternoon, Danica was invited to speak at the National Aviation Policy Forum in Washington, D.C. The event was formal, filled with executives, regulators, and politicians, all dressed in tailored suits and practiced smiles. But when Danica took the stage, again in jeans, boots, and a simple blouse, the room shifted. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. She stood at the podium, calm and centered, and spoke not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a citizen who had once been told, politely, cruelly, that she didn't belong where she was. The seat I held that day wasn't just a row number. It was a symbol of earned place. I didn't demand it. I didn't upgrade myself into it. It was mine. But someone looked at me and saw a mistake. That's the core of what we're fixing. Not just policy, but perception. We can train 1,000 employees. We can write 100 rules. But none of that matters if people still believe that some travelers come with conditions, while others are given comfort by default. This isn't just about one airline, or even one industry. It's about the difference between power and dignity. One can be given. The other must be recognized. And dignity is not a reward, it's a right. When she stepped away from the podium, the applause wasn't loud. It was long, sustained, respectful, real. That evening, after the forum, Danica walked through the streets of D.C. alone. The air was cool, and the city buzzed with life. Car horns, voices, the occasional burst of laughter from a restaurant patio. She found herself drawn to the National Mall, where the monument stood bathed in soft golden light. She sat on a bench across from the Lincoln Memorial, the stone giant watching over the city with silent patience. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to think back to that exact moment on the plane. The moment Ms. Burke touched her arm, told her to move, told her she didn't belong. It still stung. But it didn't define her. She had redefined it. That single moment, one hand on her shoulder, one assumption disguised as authority, had spiraled into something none of them could have predicted. Not because she yelled, not because she fought, but because she stood up by sitting down and refused to let the silence win. Across the mall, the wind picked up slightly. Flags fluttered. Lights shimmered on the reflecting pool. Danica sat still, hands in her lap, not smiling, but steady. There were no more apologies to demand, no more statements to wait for, no more stages to stand on, only life. And in that life she had claimed something no uniform or medal could give her, the power to be seen, and the strength to stay seated when the world tells you to stand somewhere else. And that, quietly, unshakably, was how she rewrote the rules, not just for herself, but for every soul who had ever been told, in any way, "You don't belong here. Not anymore. Never again." If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Thanks for watching.